Hello and welcome to the Training Grounds podcast. This is part 2 of the American coffee history episode. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I strongly suggest that you do so. It's going to matter a lot at the end. And then join us back here where we will be picking up with coffee culture post-World War I. In this post-World War I, pre-World War II world, cafe culture hadn't really caught on in the US the way that it had in Europe. Coffee was consumed primarily in the home and in the workplace, and really only sold in restaurants rather than having their own dedicated storefronts. The only exceptions were immigrant communities, primarily Italians, Slovenes, and Greeks. Some luxury restaurants continued the genteel, sociable traditions. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel maintained the men's cafe in its public corridors near the Palm Garden restaurant in New York. This was a place for stockbrokers and men of affairs to pick up stock tips, deliver financial advice, drink and keep an eye on business, all within the view of one of the main social dining rooms in all of New York and the nation. But for the most part, immigrant establishments remained primarily ethnic enclaves, not attracting the white working class Americans. The bohemian or creative movement of the late 1800s to early 1900s frequented bars and saloons, and even during Prohibition, they moved to speakeasies. It's not like they decided to change over to cafes. Now let's talk about a woman that just disappoints me. Alice Foote McDougall. So listen, you guys, I know I don't seem like I have a balanced opinion, but the reality is there are some historical figures, regardless of gender, that I'm just gonna roast. And unfortunately, Alice Foote McDougall is one of those people. In the early 1900s, most dining establishments were off limits to women. They primarily were filled with gruff working men. And as more women joined the workforce, there was an opening in the market for agreeable places to eat. And in 1907, Alice McDougall found herself a widowed mother of 3, needing to find a way to support herself. Now, her husband had tried to be a coffee wholesaler and would roast beans for home use, and this was really one of the only skills she was familiar with. And in 1907, she entered the coffee roasting and retail business under the name A.F. McDougall, knowing some customers and suppliers were against the idea of women in business. However, it wouldn't be long until she used her full name as the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement became more popular. It should be noted that Alice was not a feminist icon. I just want to make that so clear. She was anti-suffragist and declared herself a mid-Victorian, whatever the fuck that means. She believed that women shouldn't have the right to vote or aspire to be anything other than a wife and mother, which, yeah, I would say mid-Victorian, that's a pretty mid-take, you dumb bitch. And also, too, so she knew that people would be against women in business, and that's why she went by a pseudonym. And it's like, yeah, bitch, because because you're against women in business. The call is coming from inside the goddamn house. In December of 1935, she wrote a letter to the New York Times saying, most, parentheses, of course, not all, end parentheses, women are an intrusion in the orderly procession of commercial life. Untrained, unfitted, full of tradition, prejudices, and inhibitions, she is the fool who rushes in where wise men feared to tread. Oh boy, let me just, that's my knuckles cracking because I'm about to throw the fuck down. It's just a really rich thing to say because it's like, aren't you the one that was untrained, unfitted? You're full of tradition because you don't think women should be in the workforce, prejudices because you think women are stupid. Also, if it wasn't for women that chose to be fools who rushed in where wise men feared to tread, we would not have car heaters, the game of Monopoly, the fucking fire escape, life rafts, residential solar heating, the medical syringe, the modern electric refrigerator, ice cream makers, computers, telecommunication technology, the dishwasher, wireless transmission technology, closed-circuit television security, the modern paper bag, central heating, Kevlar, computer goddamn software. We wouldn't know the helix structure of DNA. There are so many things that women have discovered and contributed to and created, things that men had more than enough opportunities to create. So I don't know who the fuck Alice here thinks that she is. I'm not the biggest fan of Little Miss McDougal. In 1919, she opened her first cafe in Grand Central called the Little Coffee Shop, and it opened with the intention of selling her roasted coffee, and initially it didn't do well, but once prospective customers started asking to sample the coffee, Alice set out chairs and tables, which naturally led to a sit-down cafe. Alice decorated her cafes with velvet curtains, pretty china, very much catering and attracting that female clientele. She introduced waffles to the menu, and that was it. The business took off. And she certainly thought working there was an honor because she charged her waitresses $10 a day to work there, which is a choice. We'll just say it's that, Alice. It was a choice you made. She's widely considered the first female Q grader in the country, and at the time, the only woman to be importing coffee. She went on to open numerous cafes in NYC, but girl, no amount of cafes could insulate her from the Great Depression, and her business was forced into bankruptcy. Wah, wah. Bummer. Guess charging her waitresses $10 a day to work there just wasn't enough to save you. Damn, that's crazy. With the tanking of the U.S. economy during the Great Depression, spending on non-essentials, it virtually ceased. No one could afford the 5 cents that a coffee cost, which in today's money is roughly 89 cents, but coffee was still consumed. Soup kitchens began to pop up across the US, and they would serve coffee along with soups and sandwiches, donuts. I do want to say, I know a lot about the Great Depression, like probably more than most people do, mainly because I was obsessed with Kit, the American Girl doll, Kit Kittredge, primarily because I looked like exactly like her as a child. I had the like blonde bobbed haircut. So it really was a match made in heaven for me. And I read all of those books. I know so much. Like my AP history final, we could either do like a presentation for the class, you could write a term paper, or you could have written like a novella. And I wrote a novella set during the Great Depression about this girl that was like working in her family's cafe to try and help them out. And, this hobo down by the train tracks that like played the fiddle. It was literally Great Depression fan fiction, but I got a 100% on it. And I have a feeling it's because he did not read it, but he was at least impressed that I put in the effort to write 50 pages of something. With the Great Depression came this birth of the idea of the soup kitchen, and they were all across the country. It was a place where people would line up down the block to get exactly that: soup, bread, really just anything to help sustain them throughout the day while they worked to try and make a little bit of money. It's widely assumed that soup kitchens are also where the tradition of donuts and coffee came from, with Al Capone's soup kitchen in Chicago frequently gave out coffee and donuts. And it's also likely that because coffee was free for so long, that the US continues to expect a very cheap cup of coffee. In 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt starts the radio series Over Our Coffee Cups, which would run until April of 1942. And on this show, she discussed current events, politics, and the war, and it was sponsored by the Pan American Coffee Bureau, which was a trade organization representing 8 Latin American coffee-producing countries. In November of 1942, coffee rationing in the U.S. begins, and even though there were bumper crops, which is unusually high yields of coffee coming from South and Central America, a lot of it wasn't getting to the US as ships were being sunk by German U-boats. The coffee that did make it through, including instant coffee, was prioritized for the troops. Now, before going for rationing, the government tried to manage the shortage by limiting the amount of coffee roasting companies could use. In April of 1942, they imposed a limit of 75% of the previous year's amount, and in September, they lowered it again to 65%. Consumers Consumer demand remained high, though, regardless of the drop in supply, staying at pre-war levels of roughly 20 pounds of coffee per person a year. Now, before rationing began to prevent hoarding coffee, sales were halted for a week. And from there, people were given ration books with stamps that could be used for coffee purchases. And coffee was the second good to be rationed, sugar being the first. These rations cut consumers' coffee supply in half. Before, Americans, like I said, were used to that 20 pounds of coffee per person a year, and now they would have to get by on 10.5 pounds. And the government promoted rationing as a matter of patriotism for the troops and a matter of fairness on the home front. Without rationing, the idea was that some would get more than their fair share and others wouldn't get what they need. Coffee rationing was deeply unpopular, but citizens were determined to support the troops, as nearly everyone knew someone affected by the draft. And with the slashing of available coffee, the options became to drink less or stretch the coffee and continue to have the same number of cups a day. Roughly 2.5 cups a day was the average then. A Life article at the time offered some solutions, one being that people could use a level scoop instead of a heaping scoop. Using a percolator or a stovetop brewer would increase the yield of coffee. You could double drip by reusing the grinds, although experts advised against that. You could also underfill your coffee cup, and some people even took to using smaller teacups for their coffee. Chicory was also recommended to supplement the coffee, and chicory in coffee kind of remains a thing today. I know Blue Bottle Coffee, I believe, does either a cold brew or some kind of coffee with chicory involved. Diners that previously offered bottomless coffee now limit guests to 1 per cup. One such place did offer a second cup for $100, which is just over $2,000 today. It's not noted if anyone ever purchased that second cup. I'm going to go ahead and guess not. In 1943, coffee rations were slashed again to 8.5 pounds a year, and to preserve supply, households with more than one ration book were asked to spread out their coffee purchases over the 6-week periods that their booklets covered, instead of getting their entire ration at the beginning. And in July of 1943, coffee rationing ends. Coffee was the first rationed item to leave the list. Sugar would be rationed until 1947. Price controls were put into place, though, so consumption didn't return to pre-war levels right away. And of course, we can't talk about World War II without going over the story of the Americano. It's widely accepted that during World War II, American soldiers, they were in Italy, they were unfamiliar with espresso. Espresso hadn't really entered the American coffee world at that point. It was really relegated to, like we said, the immigrant enclaves. And when they ordered a coffee and were presented with espresso, the story goes, they went to the barista, they're like, what is this? We're not done here. And the compromise that was reached was to put that espresso over some hot water, sort of giving them something similar to the drip coffee that they were accustomed to. In the 1950s and 60s, cafe culture finally begins to take root the way that it had in other countries. Coffee shops became the place for young people to gather. Generally, these places were alcohol-free, so many teens took to hanging out at coffee shops where for a few cents they could get a cup of coffee and sit for hours. Here, art flourished, particularly music, comedy, and poetry. This desire to drop out of the rat race and sort of live an existentialist, non-consumerist life was a direct result of World War II and its societal aftermath. Because cafes were enjoyed by youths, of course, older generations looked down on these spaces, calling them immoral, with one man saying, "You can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl," which I find it so funny. They've been having the same problem since the 1950s. Like, you're fine. You're literally okay. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect you. You are totally okay. Don't worry about it. Now, I do want to take just a sidebar for a moment and talk specifically about the history of coffee shops in New York City. Really, because coffee shops are popping up all over the United States, but it's the coffee shops of New York that have a big influence on history, especially arts and culture once we get into the 50s and 60s. But let's take a little bit of a step back here. And in 1696, John Hutchins purchases land in New York on Broadway near today's Cedar Street. And he built a house that he later opened to the public and served coffee. It was officially called the King's Arms, being the first and at that time only coffee house in New York. It became known simply as the Coffee House, and it provided both public and private dining options with curtained booths and large meeting rooms. And these areas are where local merchants, businessmen, and politicians would meet and make deals. This model, cafes as a place to do business, would be copy and pasted all over New York, some more noteworthy than others. The Merchants Coffee House opened around 1737 and is probably the most historically consequential. Like other cafes before it, it was a place for businessmen to meet, and it was a principal public gathering space. In 1765, in order to stop protesting, the Stamp Act was read aloud. It held debates on accepting British goods. It hosted demonstrations by the Sons of Liberty. In 1774, the first idea of a Congress of Deputies from each colony was formed here. So essentially the idea of Congress was born out of a coffee shop, and the forming of the Committee of 100 to administer the public business, essentially making the coffee house the seat of government. It also housed numerous societies and clubs. The Tontine Coffee House opened in 1793 and would soon become home to the New York Stock and Exchange Board in 1817. Soon, office buildings, clubs, and hotels were built, which took the place of the businesses, social, and that food and board aspect that coffee houses of the time had to offer, and their popularity tapered off. And it would take roughly a century for those immigrant cafes to begin popping up in New York, bringing with them the cafe culture of Europe, which had long been influenced by art and intellectuals. And while chains like Chock-full of Nuts existed to feed the commodity space, cafes in places like Greenwich Village offered something very different. In 1927, Cafe Reggio opened in Greenwich Village. Dominic Parisi sent his entire life savings of $1,000, which is roughly $18,000 today, to Italy to get an espresso machine, and America's first cappuccino was served. Historically, the success of cafes as a facet of cultural revolution, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. If anything, it happens in a pressure cooker. And in the case of post-World War II America, this success was happening against the backdrop of a rapidly changing status quo. Suburbanization, the baby boom, post-war sentiments regarding civil and social rights, and U.S. foreign policy all gave rise to movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the Free Speech Movement, anti-war movements, including opposition to the Vietnam War, and the Gay Rights Movement. And along with these was the counterculture movement, which was a movement defined by peace and an endorsement of freedom. Social anthropologist Gentry Andres, who lived and studied in a counterculture community, said of it, freedom to explore one's potential, freedom to create oneself, freedom of personal expression, freedom from scheduling, freedom from rigidity, defined roles and hierarchical statuses, aesthetic sense, love of nature, passion of music, desire for reflection, and strongly marked independence. Artists took to the coffee shops of Greenwich Village to write and perform, with many cafes serving as the training grounds for America's most prominent artists. The Cafe Reggio became one of these places, with writers Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac frequenting it while in college at Columbia, likely attracted to a space that had no pretension. The San Remo Cafe opened in 1925, and by the late 40s, early 50s, it began to attract beats, artists, actors, and most notably, the gay community. This was a mob-owned cafe, and the mob, as well as local Italians, were hostile to gay people. However, the San Remo tolerated their business. Amongst the clientele was Tennessee Williams, Gore Vidal, James Baldwin, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, Andy Warhol, and Edward Albee. A veritable who's who of culture in America. Cafe Bazaar opened in 1957. It was here that Andy Warhol saw the Velvet Underground perform for the first time and led to him becoming their manager. The Cafe Chino in 1958 to 1968 is considered the birthplace of off-Broadway. This is actually one of my favorite stories. So it was opened by Joe Chino of Sicilian immigrants with the intention of poetry readings. It soon became a place for experimental experimental theater. He would open shows by playing a wind chime and saying, "It's magic time." Even if there was no one in attendance, he would say, "Do it for the room." He didn't read the plays to screen what shows he would put on. Instead, he would ask the writers their astrological sign, and if he liked the answer, he gave a date, is one of the stories. Chino was flouting several laws, however. For one, in order to have performances, they needed a liquor and a cabaret license, but had neither. It was also illegal to depict homosexuality on stage, and a majority of the playwrights were gay men. And because of this, Joe spent a lot of time doing outside work, including sex work, in order to pay fines and bribes. The crew at the Chino didn't take any pay for their work at the cafe, including Joe, and if there was any desired payment, it was simply inclusion in future productions. Dames at Sea is one notable breakout production from the Chino. In 1926, New York passed the cabaret laws, so essentially this banned dancing, playing instruments, and singing in places open to the public that sold food and drink unless they had a cabaret license. So you would have to get a liquor license before you could get a cabaret license, and all the employees had to be fingerprinted and photographed. And these licenses were expensive, and the city was blocking certain clubs and performers from being able to obtain them. And yeah, I have a problem with that. First of all, what are they doing with those fingerprints in 1926? That's entirely a scare tactic, an intimidation tactic, to have to photograph and fingerprint someone. Like, come on, what are you going to do with that in 1926? Fucking nothing. Now, Cafe Wa opened in 1959 by Manny Roth and still standing today, had a huge influence on music of all genres. It was joked amongst the patrons that the tea was missing because the beatniks drank espresso. Now, Roth wasn't a fan of the cabaret laws, and he dedicated himself to protecting the industry from politicians looking to limit the influence of music. The Gaslight Cafe across the street, another famous spot for performers, didn't have their license, and one night when Roth heard authorities were coming to shut down the Gaslight, he went over and helped them board themselves in. And to avoid noise complaints, guests at the Gaslight would snap instead of clap. I think that snapping at poetry is like kind of a cliche thing nowadays that we talk about, but it didn't come from nowhere, it seems. It was the Cafe Wa in 1961 where Bob Dylan got his first regular gig as a backup harmonica player after playing one of the cafe hootenannies, which were essentially open mic nights. However, after being late 3 nights in a row, he was fired. So yeah, guys, show up for work, maybe. Although he didn't show up for work and he still turned out to be Bob Dylan, so I don't know. Maybe I don't know anything. Peter, Paul, and Mary formed here, with Mary Travers having been a waitress there. Jimi Hendrix got his first recurring gig that gave him a chance to grow as a musician there in 1966, billed as Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. In 1967, Bruce Springsteen's band, the Castiles, played afternoon sets there for 2 months. Van Halen's frontman, David Lee Roth, is Manny Roth's nephew, and several notable comedians got their start at the Wa, including Robert Klein, Joan Rivers, Woody Allen, Lenny Bruce, Bill Cosby, and Richard Pryor. Cafe A-Go-Go opened in 1964 and also had several claims to fame. It was the first New York City venue for the Grateful Dead. It's also where Lenny Bruce would be arrested for obscenity charges for performing comedy that was considered too offensive, which kicked off a battle for free speech in comedy. What about the coffee, right? We're talking all about the culture. What about the coffee? Because at this point, it's still pretty basic. It's very much simple, low skill kind of position, just something that's served alongside a bunch of other offerings, right? Well, Alfred Peet immigrates from the Netherlands to San Francisco in 1955, and he was shocked by how bad the coffee was. He said, "I came to the richest country in the world, so why are they drinking the lousiest coffee?" Incredible question, Pete. I ask myself the same thing. Opening in 1966, Pete sold coffee roasted dark, a style he learned in Indonesia and and was accustomed to within European coffee houses as well. The concept of sitting and drinking coffee hadn't quite entered the culture in California just yet, so Peet sold freshly roasted beans, and he would grind them for the customers. He did have a separate bar area where guests could sample the coffee before deciding what beans to buy. He took coffee incredibly seriously, and he taught all of his employees how to cup coffee and understand aromas and flavors. His passion for blending coffees and having conversations with customers about origins and processing has him credited as the man that brought curiosity about coffee to the US. The Beat movement found homes in cafes across the country, from California to New Orleans and, of course, Seattle. Now, one of those connecting factors in all of these shops is culture over coffee. Coffee was an afterthought for many of these places, and it's evidenced by a lot of them becoming bars in their later years. It's also reflective of coffee culture at the time at large. Quality was an afterthought. There was little incentive for places selling coffee to purchase quality or specialty beans when their own clientele was accustomed to a quick, cheap cup to fuel their day and keep them writing. Now, Starbucks opened in Seattle in 1971 by founders Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker. They were friends that had all learned about coffee roasting from Peet's Coffee, Alfred Peet. Now, originally, Starbucks was just a counter in a narrow store without seating, as they only sold beans, very similar to Peet's. No brewed coffee other than the free sample of the brewed beans for purchase. For the first year, they purchased their green coffee from Peet's, but soon moved on to buying directly from farmers. And this was a huge hit amongst the crowd of the 70s Seattle coffee aficionados. And demand grew so much that by the end of the decade, Howard Schultz, who had been the general manager of their filter supplier, visited, and he was impressed enough to join the team as their director of marketing in 1982. In 1982, he would take a trip to Milan that revolutionized how Howard saw cafe culture. He witnessed a third space where people could chat about business and politics, where school children play while parents caught up. When the founders weren't really open to this change, Schultz left in 1985 and opened his own cafe. And 2 years later, he found enough investors to buy Starbucks. And this ushered in the second wave of coffee across the US. We're going to be talking about this at the very end, but just to touch on this, coffee's second wave, it focused on quality coffee and customer experience, with an emphasis on the ambiance and getting people to spend more time in the cafe. Now, the role of the barista kind of begins to take shape at this time in history. Previously, coffee offerings were simple enough that regular waitstaff or the owners could operate the machines and serve the coffee. Second wave coffee brought this emergence of coffee-based drinks, particularly espresso-based drinks, as the norm. Up to now, drip coffees and even just straight espressos were the go-to, but soon espresso-based drinks with syrups and the addition of blended drinks suddenly made the role of barista more specialized, and they were now also tasked with curating and maintaining the feel of the shop, getting to know customers and creating a warm, inviting space. Ironically, Starbucks never fully reached Howard's dream of becoming this third space. He was passionate about the idea of the place on the corner, a real-life alternative to TV, an easy escape from the day-to-day mundane that doesn't require getting in a car. However, society and capitalism's desire for that secure, sterile, predictable transaction, predictable environment, saw that dream die fairly quickly. In fact, Schultz himself attributed Starbucks' modern failures to those super automatic machines taking away the artistry, as well as copy and pasting store layouts that were stripped of any coziness of the mom and pop shop. And all of this modernization was done by CEO Jim Donald, who was previously a Walmart executive. So I don't know, guys. I just don't know. Today, Starbucks isn't a third space, it's a second space. Most people treat it like it's a home office. Now, what Starbucks did do was pave the way for cafes that would go on to achieve that goal, like actually factually achieve it, including places that hadn't had a strong coffee culture before Starbucks infiltrated the market. So let's talk about those waves of coffee. They're defined by how consumers in the US specifically interact with or relate to coffee as a consumable good. So this changes significantly and quickly, and it's influenced by historical and cultural changes around the world. Something to keep in mind when we discuss them, they are all happening at this exact moment. These are all open-ended waves that are just continuing to roll out on the shores of our existence. The first wave, this was what we talked about in the very beginning. It's the shift from luxury to commodity around the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution bringing the invention of instant coffee and vacuum sealing. It made it a lot easier for marketers to get coffee in the home of every American. First wave coffee was primarily sold in bulk to restaurants, grocery stores, diners, hotels, and other large establishments. And because the primary focus of their consumer at this time was on just like a caffeine boost, info like origin, flavors, processing, roast levels, anything like that, not mentioned on the packaging, it's typically going to be a darker roasted, bitter coffee, pre-ground with an emphasis on consistent cups, keeping in mind something can be consistently bad and still be consistent. The reason for that really dark roast is to cover up any defects in the beans and also to cover up just the general quality of those beans. Second wave is generally considered to have started in the 70s, ushered in by brands like we said, like Peet's and Starbucks. It's this beginning of the rise of independent brands that are attempting to set themselves apart from larger brands by selling coffee of a higher quality. Consumers, they know more about these beans and the coffee that they're purchasing. Primarily, origin and tasting notes are things that are going to be told to the customer. Major emphasis on cafe space, baristas especially, and those espresso-based drinks. This is where that third space comes into play, and shows like Friends really show how coffee had moved from commodity to culture. Baristas in this wave, relatively educated about the coffees they're serving, but their primary purpose was to curate a space where people wanted to spend time. Their passion was for the cafe, not so much the beans. And they're now serving espresso-based drinks, the prevalence of syrups, of blended coffee drinks, and through this, making the role of barista much more skilled. Also, this is when the concept of cappuccinos and lattes enters the public zeitgeist. I would say I got my start in a second wave cafe. They really had an emphasis on making a space that people wanted to sit and stay. We had board games people could play at certain locations. The lighting was always inviting. It was always just a quirky, cute, cozy kind of space. And we definitely did not have a focus on the coffee at all, but we sure did sell some really tasty blended drinks. It just had so much sugar in it. Definitely not good for you. So the third wave. There's some debate here on the definition and beginning. So some people place the start of the third wave in the 80s, mainly around the founding of the Specialty Coffee Association. Others place it in the early 2000s to mid 2010s, and some say a third wave never really happened. It's just that specialty coffee became a concept that moved to the forefront of the industry. But for our purposes, we'll talk about it like a wave. So it's marked by a shift in consumer awareness. During this wave, most roasters began advertising the things that we're used to seeing today on bags of coffee: origin, roast, tasting notes, processing method, elevation, fair trade, direct trade, organic certification, roast date, all of those things and more. More thought is also put into the finer details of the coffee. Baristas are now able to answer questions about their beans, and they're typically very well versed in artisanal brew methods, with things like pour-overs becoming popular with this wave, and also latte art becomes a lot more prevalent. Lighter roasts startups enter the industry, and consumers realize that coffee can be more than just something bitter that kind of has to be masked with syrups. Home equipment also begins to permeate the industry, making everyday people more intimately connected to the process of making coffee, much like we had been centuries ago. And this is also where a lot of the snobbery surrounding the coffee industry comes into play. So fourth and fifth wave, they haven't really been fully established yet, mostly because we're living them, and a lot of people see fifth wave as more conceptual, but fourth wave involves science on a new level. So new brew methods, water temperatures, water quality, food science, processing methods, so much more, all in pursuit of new experiences. Influencers, affordability, and coffee that's shipped right to your door are also going to take a forefront. This is thanks a lot in part to the pandemic. Brands like Chamberlain Coffee, Cometeer, they're aiming to make coffee consumption as easy as possible, and ready to drink cans like cold brews, draft lattes are also becoming more ubiquitous. Fifth wave, again, some say more conceptual. So it's focused on business and success, from creating professional careers to creating sustainable and profitable businesses with a strong high-end coffee offering. They're very commercialized, and they definitely use social media to promote themselves. It's characterized by hyper-professionalism, operational excellence, investment in tech, training and people development programs, supporting valuable career paths for a new breed of hospitality professionals. It reflects this new era of scaled boutique hospitality. Common signs: small boutique stores, big investment in coffee shop design with distinct concepts, diverse products, and eye-catching displays. That sounds an awful lot like a previous employer of mine. Strong focus on continuous improvement towards excellence, commercializing products with increasing value, prioritizing overall customer experience, and constant investment in new tech and team development. The coffee space is ever developing, and I think that right now more than ever, it is so important to remind ourselves of how powerful cafe spaces can be. They are a place for community. They are a place for interpersonal relationships to be strengthened, to be formed. They are ways to have your point of view changed. They are ways to just become a more active member in your community. I think we've all really been gaslit into believing that sweeping change must come from the top, but it's actually the opposite. It needs to start grassroots. It needs to start with each and every one of us. It needs to start in our neighborhoods, in our own cafes, and it needs to escalate upwards. And historically, we have the precedent for that. We know that it's possible. We have done it before. So do not allow Starbucks's rebrand, its attempt to reclaim the third space mentality. Don't let them fool you. I beg you, frequent your local coffee shops. They are the ones making a difference, and every penny you spend at them is a penny that is going towards an actual human being and not some runaway corporate entity that its employees have to fight tooth and nail to get the very basics to be able to survive. Coffee shops are powerful. If you are a barista, your job is powerful, and you may think, oh, my employer doesn't care. That's fine. Your employer doesn't have to care. You individually can care. And that looks like, number one, educating yourself. That's a huge thing that you can do. And number two, if your cafe isn't offering that, go find a cafe that is, not necessarily to work there, but just to provide resources. And I also ask you to look into resources in your area so that if somebody does come into your cafe in a time of need, you will be prepared to help them. Never put yourself in danger for any reason. You are not meant to save people, but you are absolutely an integral part of your community. And I ask you to do your part, whether that is a clothing drive in the winter, whether that is going to local artisans and inviting them to do a private event. I am asking you to partner with other local businesses to get your coffee, to get your baked goods, to get your bottled drinks, anything like that. Whatever we can do on a small grassroots level is going to be so important for the future of coffee coffee culture in America, and you get to be part of that, both as a consumer and as a barista. Take from that what you will and go forth into the world. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Training Grounds podcast. I will catch you in the next one. As this usually goes, I don't have a set schedule. My set schedule is whenever I get to it. Take care, guys.